I'm going to just start by talking a little bit about my dad's coming to Arizona when in 1954 he was a medical student. He was a senior in medical school. They used to give them 2-month clinic or internships where they'd ship him off places, and he came to Arizona, Fort Defiance, and he was working on, was it tuberculosis control? And there's a tradition that if you wear out a pair of shoes in Arizona, you have to come back. So when he graduated from medical school, he had met my mom. They had gone out on 4 dates, and he proposed to her by saying, "I'm leaving for Arizona in a month, and I want you to come with me." And she said, "My parents won't let me come unless I'm married." He said, "Okay." So, and I'll let you know in a week, and she let him know, and that was that. And so they got married in July and took a 1-week honeymoon driving cross country to come back to Tuba City, Arizona. While there, Dad was not yet a surgeon. He was a doctor on the reservation with the public health department. And my mother taught in the one-room schoolhouse, and I learned things all the time, but my dad told me about that the schoolroom had 4 grades in it, and they all faced in different directions in the room, and Mom would sort of go from side to side to side to teach the kids in that one-room schoolhouse. Meanwhile, they were meeting the people who were on the reservation. Many of them had a connection to the hospital. So one of my favorite stories was the knock on the door on Erev Yom Kippur, and here was a wonderful woman, Dorothy Eubanks, and she brought a bottle of Jim Beam. She said, "I heard it's your New Year, so Happy New Year," and she handed them a bottle of Jim Beam. And meanwhile, my dad was davening by himself in the house, and then their Jewish life was really limited to what they could do for each other, so they would ship in every 2 or 3 months a quarter of a cow and from Denver, and they were strictly kosher, and they had a deep freeze, and they would store it and use it and then when they used it up, they'd ship in another 4/4 of a cow. But when they found out that my mom was pregnant, it was kind of difficult thinking, okay, we've got to arrange a bris. We've got to have the baby named in shul. So they had all the relatives in New York ready for the phone call if I was going to be a boy, that they could do a pidyon haben. They had it all set up for the eventuality that I was a boy, but I wasn't, so it was okay. Anyway, their next door neighbor was a man, or across the street, named Mark Begay, and his wife was a nurse in the hospital, and they became very close friends. And Mark was a Hopi mudhead. No? He was Navajo. Then who was the mudhead?
What the hell was his name?
Another guy. Don Angiva was a Hopi mudhead, and they arranged for, as a special treat, you didn't put on your mudhead for the goyim. You only did it for members of the tribe who were going to be actually praying with you or doing the ceremonies with you, but because they were such good friends, they got permission to actually bring my parents into the Hopi Kiva and experience one of the, I guess they called them ceremonials. And during that time, my mother was pregnant with me, and the legend goes that as the music started and the drumming started, I started dancing in utero, and they knew I was going to be a cantor from that day on because I responded so strongly to religious music. Anyway, another one of their neighbors was a wind talker, which if you know the story of World War II, the Germans were constantly breaking our codes, and the one thing they could not break was the Navajo language, because it was a tonal language. So you could say Diné and it would mean the people, or you could say Diné and it would mean the tiger, or you could say Diné and it would mean, you know, the laundry's outside. I mean, it could be, it's one of those languages, there are 12 tones in the Navajo language. So it was very difficult to understand unless you were raised speaking that language, because the tone would change. I experienced the same thing with Cantonese. When I lived in Hong Kong, I would tell a taxi driver my address, and I would say, Chatsap Ho Robinson Do, which was 77 Robinson Street. But if I said Robinson Ho, like, do you know where that is? With an American intonation, they'd go, what? And they'd have no clue. I'd say, Robinson Do Chatsap Ho. And they'd go, oh, okay. And they'd take me to the right place. So my parents knew words of Navajo. My dad learned more than my mom did, but it's not really a spoken language in my home because it was very difficult to really understand. Anyway, Mark Begay, who was a very good friend of theirs, whose wife was the nurse at the hospital, made the commitment to make a cradle board for me. And the tradition is that you start the cradle board the morning the baby is born. It must be done by sundown that day. So it's a one-day project. And his wife made my mother a squaw dress. And I actually have a copy of a picture that I'm going to send around of my parents at the Navajo Reservation when I was a newborn in the cradle board with my mother in the squaw dress. We're going to find the original picture and make it available to you to actually post with this, because it's very cool. I didn't have the original picture, but Dad has it in an album somewhere, so I will find it for you. But that's me in my cradle board. And the tribe basically adopted my dad and mom. I'm convinced that the reason was that as a doctor, my dad had great respect for their traditions. And so he would invite the medicine man in to the hospital room when he was treating somebody from the tribe who believed the Navajo tradition of healing. So it was never, oh, we're the real doctors and your tradition doesn't have any value. And I think they really appreciated the fact, first of all, the medicine men didn't ever tell his patients, don't go to them because he won't be able to help you. They really integrated the Navajo tradition with American medical practice so that people got the benefit of both, I don't want to say real medicine, but spiritual medicine and the medicine that was available in the 1950s. The only other little bit I will tell you is that in those days, Mark actually and my dad went across the Grand Canyon. They hiked down from the South Rim to up the North Rim. It took them about 24 hours to do it. It takes me 24 hours to go down a mile and back up. So he was in great shape in those days.
We slept at the bottom.
They slept at the bottom for a little while and came back up the top. And my mother, who was pregnant, was not allowed to make the hike. So she dropped them off at the South Rim and then picked them up at the North Rim. But they had a wonderful opportunity to be a part of the Navajo traditions. And I remember as a child, when I was older, going back and experiencing the powwows where they all gathered in a park and people were camping out. We had our van that we slept in. That was kind of scary. But we experienced a lot of the culture of the Navajo people because they were happy to share it with somebody who showed such respect for their spiritual tradition. I'm going to tell you right now that I probably can't answer a lot of the questions, but that's why I brought my dad. So if you have any questions about life on the reservation. Oh, the other thing was that people, and this is again, not memory, but story, people would sometimes bring gifts in lieu of money. So at one point you had how many chickens in your living room? They had, yeah, 6 chicks that were brought.
5 died.
And they were raising a chicken in their living room who woke them up every morning. It was loud. It was a very small house. It was not university, government housing. So it was like a little tiny cottage. How many? 900 square feet for a family of 3 and chickens. So, so there are lots of stories about that kind of, in that nature, but if you have questions, please, yes.
I have a few questions. What year was this that you came?
1954, first time.
And from where?
1955 through 7.
Bronx.
From the Bronx to
Yes.
Arizona.
First time out of New York State.
And how about where was the actual reservation? You know, geographically?
Fort Defiance.
Well, no.
Navajo Reservation is the northeast
Right.
part of Arizona and bleeds over into New Mexico.
Okay.
Fort Defiance is about 15 miles in from the road that
But
goes
where's
north.
Tuba?
Yeah, and then that was the first time. Then I was cross reservation, Tuba City, that's on 86,
Okay.
just off of Cameron.
And this friend, the gay, is that the last name?
Yeah,
It's a very
That's a
common.
very
I was
big-
just going to say,
Very
there's a
big,
very
very big
well-known
clan.
golfer
it's a very big clan.
today
Yeah.
whose last name is Gay.
Yeah, I had a boy,
It's a huge clan.
It's common like
it's a common, it's like Smith or Jones.
Right.
Wilson McGay came to Saguaro High School when I was going there in Tucson. And I was excited because I knew the last name and he said, nah,
Yeah,
it's
it's
just,
just the clan.
yeah, it's like Cohen
Yeah.
in the Jewish religion. It's fairly common.
Wonderful. Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. Yes,
I'm curious what your relationship is with the tribe today.
you have a relationship with the tribe today?
Unfortunately, most of the people that I knew are deceased.
We still have
We
friends,
have the daughter of this
Eubanks.
Eubanks lives in Phoenix, and we still correspond. And I know her and her husband and her children. Her brother, an interesting story, Dottie Eubanks couldn't get pregnant for some reason or other. So right after Janece was born, she adopted a little boy. Next year she was pregnant.
When my mom was pregnant with my brother,
Really.
and the kids were born 3 days apart with the same initials, SG. So it was Susan Gale and Spencer Guy.
And Susan is still a very, very good friend and in contact. But unfortunately, most of the Navajo that I knew have passed away, and the Hopis. But, look,
You know, Dad was really, how old were
I was
you,
young, I was
27?
20, no,
20,
I was 25.
in medical school?
Sure.
Right.
And then, you know, on the Navajo reservation, in Tuba City, he was like 27 when I was born, so, yeah.
I just wondered, after you left the reservation, how long were you there for a second time? And then
2 years.
2 years, and then you
He went
Then I
to
went
New York.
back for a surgical residency and then came out to Sells, where the Public Health Service put me in charge of the hospital.
In those days,
I
it
was
was
there
the
for a
Papago.
year.
Yeah, that
Then it was time for them to go to school, so we moved into Tucson. Dottie taught out at Sells also.
Yeah,
I'm wondering if there are any parallels or similarities between Navajo tradition and Jewish tradition. Had you noticed any?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Can you describe them or tell us what they are?
Well, they don't have a Sabbath. They don't. But as far as family relationships, very similar. There's no boss, except the mother, of course.
Right.
yeah. the way you-
And the way they care for their children, very similar. As far as ritual, they have a lot of what they call kachinas, Now, the Kachinas are not gods. A lot of people mistake that. They think that they pray to the Kachinas. They don't. The Kachinas are the messengers, what we would call angels. And these are the representations of those angels, different Kachinas. They believe in one great spirit, and they are really a very religious people. They are very ethical. And if you're a friend for life. There's nothing they won't do for you. If you come into their house, if they're eating their last crumb of bread, they'll share it with you. And they'll go hungry rather than let a guest go hungry. And as far as prayer, they don't have organized prayers, but they do have these ceremonials, or they call them sings, where they chant all these different chants. And their healing ceremonies are quite interesting. Where they do the sand paintings on the floor, and the patient sits on the painting, and then they do all the various chants and prayers. But as far as rituals are concerned, obviously there's no similarity. But the idea...
Their spirits.
You
You know, it's interesting. From the time I was little till the last time I was up north, it's changed so much. It used to be, if you were driving along the 86 highway, you would see hogans. They were all over the place if you knew where to look. Usually it would be a hill with an antenna coming out of the ceiling. But I remember seeing them all the time. There were the summer hogans, the winter hogans, and we were there all the time. The last time I drove that way, I don't think I saw one except for in a parking lot of a trading post, you know, a souvenir store. We saw one when we went up to Monument Valley. They had a demonstration hogan that you could go in. But when I was a kid, they were all over the place. And, you know, you'd see people with their sheep. And, you know, I mean, you really saw it. It was very much, believe it or not, like the Israeli Bedouins. You know, and you would see people sitting under a tree having lunch, and the sheep around and the shepherds, and you just don't see that anymore. It's changed quite a bit. Sarah, did you have a question?
Yeah, was Spencer born on the reservation?
No, Spencer was a month after they got back to New York. I got back to New York too. Yes.
Cantor, I was wondering if your friends have heard you sing or heard you perform rituals.
No. The Navajo, by the time I was a cantor, most of the Navajos that we knew were no longer with
Or
us.
even the ones in Phoenix, and I thought that would have been an interesting.
Well, I don't know, Susan might have heard me. But she's not, she wasn't Navajo. Her father was actually full-blood Cherokee. And her mom was like a hospital administrator or
And she
something.
was half white.
So she was half.
No, her mother was half white, half Guanese, I think.
Funny, so, yeah, I was not active when, I was 9 months old when we left the reservation, and I've only visited a few times, you know, as a tourist, so not really, yes.
I work here at the museum and I bring school groups around, and a lot of kids ask about the function of the cradle board. They want to know, like,
You would not wear it on your back.
that's
I believe, you can correct me, I know you will, that the baby would be placed in it and then leaned up. There's a notch, you know, where the two boards meet, up against the bole of a tree, so that the baby would be able to see what was going on and be kept safe during working outside or working in the house.
More commonly against the loom.
Against a loom, good. That's true, I've seen pictures of that.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
very common picture. You see the mother sitting in front of the rug, weaving the rug, and the cradle board is against that notch, keeps it from falling over. Interesting thing about the cradle board, you notice the little thing at the bottom? They used to put straw, grass, and stuff down there,
Diapers were not a thing.
Peter would run down and to the,
I didn't, this one's never been used that way. I think I was in it once for that picture and then not really again.
she had,
Yeah, this was my cradle board that was made for me when I was born.
we had diapers for her.
How long do they usually keep the children in a cradle board? Up till what age?
Till they start walking, till they start walking.
I mean, they're not in it all the time. It's when mom has stuff to do. I was in
It's like a
a,
baby carriage.
yeah, or a carrier. You know, the little rocker things. I remember in England, they did a different thing. They would have a pole in the middle and then a harness, and the kid could go around in circles. It's a way to keep a child, you know, in a hogan, there's a fire. You know, you don't want your baby crawling unless you're playing with it, paying attention. So instead of, what do they call those things?
Playpen.
A playpen. This was, they would put that there to keep the baby safe. And
Very interesting medical observation or anthropological observation. Most of the babies that were in cradle boards have flat heads in the back because they're so long.
That's interesting.
and great
Navajo,
posture.
Apache, and the other
Tribes.
groups that use cradle boards. And also, they walk at an earlier age than our kids do
Because they weren't
because they're
dead.
vertical most of the time. And they have that perspective, whereas our babies, they get up and, you know.
Now, I should tell you, this white fabric is original and the straps are original. The brown fabric